Biopolitical assemblage. So I'll be talking about the assemblage theory. Assemblage theory, for those who don't know, is like the new fad in some of the quarters of geography. There's a number of people here who've written quite a lot about it. Ben Anderson, I think, did a special issue. Basically, it derives ultimately from Deleuze and Guattari, and it's been reworked by Manuel de Landa, who has coined the phrase assemblage theory. And it kind of follows on from actor network theory of Bruno Latour, in the wake of Bruno Latour's work, which you might be more familiar with. And so basically it gives gives a good grip on how to talk about processes like climate change, like racial formation in their material mechanisms. So yeah, so these are the topics. I'll go a little bit quicker. So I guess my main argument about assemblage theory, just very quickly, is that there's an anti-Marxist stream in it. And what do I mean by anti-Marxism? It basically means that there's a sort of weariness or a fatigue to do with Marxist theorizing. We saw it first in cultural studies, and then it happened in geography. And I would claim that it also goes into sort of feminist theorizing, even in post-colonial theorizing. There's just this kind of feeling of the old left, the Marxist left is defunct, it's obsolete, it's spent its critical energies, and post-structuralism kind of follows on from that, and people like Bruno Latour and Manuel de Landa are very much involved in actually avoiding any kind of Marxist theorizing. And this is ironic because within Marxist theorizing, not least in the wake of Deleuze and Guattari, but also people like Antonio Negri, Slavoj Žižek, have been injecting precisely post-structuralist innovations within the purview of Marxist theory. So when you're talking about globalization and racialization, these sorts of processes, I think that anti-Marxism is a huge mistake, because I would argue that as you could see in the crash of 2007-2008, capitalism is something that has to be theorized. The way that capital flows or doesn't flow, or crashes, or eats itself up, or gets governments to bail itself out. These sorts of questions are just central to any kind of way to think about globalization, about the world, and how it's how different places interact. So my way of thinking about race, you could liken it a lot to people like David Theo Goldberg or Howard Winant and Michael Omi. The way that racial formation is not something just sort of floating out there. It's not just prejudice. It's not something that we have in our minds. It's not, racist jokes or racist representations, only that, but it is actually sort of structures in society, social relations. It is actually populations being segregated in various places, and being given various capacities which put them on a hierarchy within society. And white people, or the people that have lighter skins, tend to benefit from that. But the main thing to understand in racial formation is that formation is a dynamic process. It's not just racial essences or racial identities, but you have a constant formation and reformation, and a sort of a constant movement of these processes. And this is where assemblage theory can reinforce those kinds of theoretical ideas. So I would say that globalization is something ecological. So as many people here would affirm, globalization as it was thought in the 90s by sociology, by geography, used to, or very much thought of globalization as just some sort of a free-floating thing. Think of Arun Baldwin's work, the infoscapes, the mediascapes, the datascapes, I forget, financescapes. These seem to be floating everywhere. They don't actually have a imbrication or an entanglement or even a triggering within physical geography. So the way that I want to think of globalization is very much influenced by Nigel Clarke's work, which is who's talking later. And Nigel will talk about globalization as something that is just a sort of a very flimsy film on top of processes which have been taking place, millennia or millions of years. So it's that kind of fragility and that kind of very superficial tip of the iceberg that globalization should be thought about. And so what this means for racism is that I look at institutional racism as something that goes all the way. Meaning this is not, institutional racism is not just within institutions, within the very rules of how schools work or how unemployment patterns appear, but they're actually ingrained in crops, in the way that diseases spread, in the way that money works, and in the way that deforestation happens. All the way for the human species. Yeah, so it's a depth that is sort of usually not seen in critical race theory. So just a few. I won't talk about ecology very much, but I'll come back to that. But the way to think about the trillions of dollars and other currencies that float around the world at the speed of light. The way to think about that in a racial way is that these flows of money do happen to bring certain bodies together in certain places who can make decisions for the rest of the planet. And so the way to think about finance is not something that is completely neutral in racial terms, not completely neutral in, we're used to thinking of finance as being reinforcing of class privilege and of national privileges, but we should also think of finance as having effects on different populations in different ways, and these populations will then be racialized. So racialization for me is not something that is just a discourse on which is sort of just added on to populations. Racialization is something that happens within the stock exchange. So it's a bit of a conceptual leap to think of finance as itself racializing. But I think that is really important, because otherwise we don't get beyond thinking of race as just something mental, just something ideological. Another way to think about race as something which is material is just through the concept of racial divisions of labor. The fact that some bodies are doing some work somewhere, and this is again directly racializing. The fact that, for example, iPods, this is a famous example, are made in certain factories in China, and the conditions are so bad that you have a true epidemic of suicides happening there. This is a racializing effect. It has nothing to do with prejudice. Of course, the prejudice and the xenophobia can come afterwards, but at that moment, it's directly racializing populations. It's making people kill themselves, and other people are benefiting from those labor regimes. So this is directly racializing. And so when I say beyond discourse, we have to look at race not just as a social construction, but as a material construction, or the social has to be sort of broadened in its scope. Think of the way that Saudi Arabia is treated by the West. If it's only about othering or self-other discourse, like we see in, for example, the war on terror or Islamophobia, then you always have these anomalies within that discursive framework, like Saudi Arabia, which benefits materially from geopolitical affiliations with the West. So the whole sort of Islamophobia suddenly disappears when we talk about Saudi Arabia. So how is that possible? So I'm just, my argument is not very complicated. It is just going back to some of the good old Marxist analysis of international relations. So I'll just sort of go on with my onslaught of like little theoretical points. What is interesting about Foucault is his understanding of dispositive. So the way that Foucault also inspires assemblage theory is by his way of talking about dispositive, which has been picked up by a number of people, Agamben, Hart and Negri again. And dispositive basically means that it's a kind of an organizing principle of an assemblage. Take an assemblage like a school or an army or a factory. There, the dispositive famously was the panopticon. So the panopticon is like an organizing principle of how to extract as much of productivity or discipline from a particular prison population or a school population. And that, where is that organizing principle in a prison? It is everywhere. So it's in the architecture, it's in the social interactions, it's in the technology, in the CCTV, it's in the rules written down. So the idea of a dispositive is a very powerful tool to understand social phenomena in their ecological workings. So, so a number of people have been using the idea of dispositive to talk about neoliberalism, of course. And one thing to remember with Foucault is that he talks about dispositive as being mobile. So a dispositive is not just something that gets invented in a certain place, but it only becomes a dispositive. It only becomes a diagram for reorganizing social life if it travels and gets applied. And then you can talk about a sudden historical break with a previous period which didn't have the dispositive. So suddenly every prison in Europe and every factory and every army barrack is organized in the same way. In the same way, the dispositive of neoliberalism pops up, gradually, as Foucault himself shows, first within intellectual circles already from the late 1930s, and then suddenly comes up, with Maggie Thatcher and Pinochet and then Ronald Reagan, and it becomes this force that self-perpetuates. So Foucault is very good at talking about this self-perpetuation. Once it's there, this dispositive, it will influence more and more systems, and in this case, governments to instigate neoliberal reforms. So that I think is very helpful with Foucault. And of course, all of these will have racializing effects, biopolitical effects. Again, this is not very well structured, but these are just sort of little thoughts. Another sloganesque thing to say is anthropogenic climate change is colonial racism continued by other means. So the way that I start thinking about climate change through this assemblage theory and through this understanding of the dispositive is the fact that the intentionality of it is not, for Foucault, it's not like a human consciousness that is behind political changes, political transformation, social innovation. It is really a question of an anonymous and a structural and a sudden shift in a mood, you could say, and you can't really say, oh, it was all Margaret Thatcher's work or all Pinochet's work or, it's George W. Bush. No, these things sort of happen. And then in hindsight, you can maybe isolate particularly important people, but the main thing is, and this is why Foucault is a structuralist, I'll come back to that, it is sort of mostly unintended. And so when I say that climate change itself is racist, this is a huge claim, and this is, I guess, my main point this morning. Climate change is itself racist. And this means that the way that it has sort of come up on the scene, I'm talking about anthropogenic climate change, the way that it has come up in history is, by definition, something that the responsibility lies with white people, within a colonial system, and the anthropos in anthropogenic is a minority of white people which unleashed certain changes in the Earth's atmosphere, and not only that, but the effects of those changes are worse for the rest of the world than they are for white people. Again, you know, this is not like a cheap kind of thing of I want to blame white people. No, the key thing is that that racism is not simply sort of a Nazi, or like it's not that there are individual racists behind this. This is a racism without racists, you could say. That's the way that I'm thinking about it. So when you have Bangladeshis suffering from flooding, this is an unintentional effect of many, many decisions made over centuries by white people, and then affecting Bangladeshis more than they are white people. Famine is a great way to think about another kind of effect. So Mike Davis is very influential within geography here when he talks about the El Nino patterns, and Nigel also talks more about this. The way that there is what he calls a Holocaust, that is a very strong word to use for the way that famine is actually caused by colonial relationships in the world, in India. But I think he uses that word Holocaust to say there is responsibility, and people at some point do make decisions knowing, if they would read their Marx and if they would read their, you know, proper sort of left-wing analyses, that this will have these effects on certain people, poor people, people already vulnerable to famine. So this is why, you know, so the whole intentionality thing is just interesting to see, because there are more and more decisions that are made. Think of the way that the IMF works. Think of the way that rules are set down for agricultural products. So at some level, I think you can start talking about actual racism. And so another example I find, two more examples, the mining that you have in so-called failed states like Congo. Famously, there's a lot of rare earth elements, or not just rare earths, but things like cadmium and copper that are mined in sub-Saharan Africa, which make it into our iPods and computers and microwaves and, you know, cars. And what they do locally is create havoc, create militias, create child soldiers, etc., etc. And of course, nothing is done very much about it. It's just sort of some peacekeeping forces which can't really do very much. You know, the usual sort of aid organizations, but there's nothing fundamentally done about that. And, you know, is that intentional racism? I think that it's an institutional kind of racism, because obviously these are problems that are not central on the agenda for the so-called international community, while others are. If there would be such a lack of institutions in somewhere in Western Europe or Australia, you know, that it wouldn't last for more than a few weeks, these emergency situations. Another favorite example of mine is e-waste, the electronic waste that becomes so sort of piling out of the global system. They have to go somewhere, because we throw away our mobile phones after, you know, 1 year, 2 years. The industry itself is built on making profits solely by having things become obsolete within 1 year. But these things have to be dismantled somewhere with huge health effects. Is this racist? I say yes, it is racist. Is it intentional racism? To some extent it is. So by looking at, these are all assemblages, these are all making connections, seeing very fragile sort of systems, ecological, material, political systems, and these connections are hidden. That's an effect of good old ideology, which Foucault can also help us look at. I think in a paper, well, the risky natures thing that Andrew co-edited, there's a great sort of, it's a simple, but it's a very powerful argument about, well, one of the arguments is about bringing political theory together with assemblage theory and with biopolitical, the concept of biopolitics. And this, I think, is essential because it can actually help to look at globalization as having these various connected but usually hidden effects. And this gets us then to thinking about politics. I'll skip over this. This is basically, it's very simple, saying that the fact that all of these futures that Andrew's introduction talks about depend more and more heavily on very sophisticated algorithms, very sophisticated and enormous data banks of data, maps, of course. So these kinds of knowledge practices that become more and more central to the way that we think about climate change, again, are based on particular presumptions. And Giovanni talked about Malthus or Marx. So that was a great way of putting it. And again, you know, most of the presuppositions of these modeling practices are Malthusian, and I would like to see them, of course, being influenced by Marx. So if we think about climate change, and if we think about population dynamics, if we think about resources, all of these things that very powerful computer models are working on, predicting the situation in 2050, predicting the situation in 2100, what if we have different presuppositions? Business doesn't have to go on usually. So maybe we can have like brighter futures if we actually say, well, let's just see for the matter of arguments how it would be if we have like a radically communist policy and all these things. So I'll just end with, because this particular session is on Foucault and on biopolitics, I quickly want to talk about his limits. These are not known, these are not new. Foucault has been criticized for decades, whether by feminists, by Marxists, and I think well, what is great about Foucault is his anti-humanism, the fact that he talks about these anonymous structures, these dispositives which don't have just one inventor, but then become very forceful and sort of inescapable, like neoliberalism seems to be sort of inescapable. But again, it's his anti-Marxism which makes him very creative, and that's why he's so great, I think, because he wanted to have like a different cut at talking about power, but he's still complementary to Marxism. I'll just sort of keep it with that. And his later work on Stoicism I find very important, because there you show that he's actually committed to change. And when he talks about the French Revolution, for example, he's actually quite beautiful. And in his interview with Chomsky, which we all know is more or less kind of anarchist, the interviewer, this is on Dutch TV in 1971, asks Foucault why he's so interested in politics. And Foucault says, why shouldn't I be interested? That is to say, what blindness, what deafness, what density of ideology would have to weigh me down to prevent me from being interested in what is probably the most crucial subject to our existence. That is to say, the society in which we live, the economic relations within which it functions, and the system of power which defines our regular forms and the regular permissions and prohibitions of our conduct. The essence of our life consists, after all, of the political functioning of the society in which we find ourselves. So this is the Foucault that I would like to keep, one who just says life itself forces us to be political. What kind of program that then sort of leads to is another question, but we cannot help but be political, otherwise we're not human. So I'll end with that.